What if I told you that some of the most shocking and disturbing practices you could imagine were just part of daily life in ancient Egypt? Today we're diving deep into a topic that most history books skip over completely. The ancient Egyptians weren't just known for their pyramids and mummies. They had some seriously dark secrets when it came to their intimate lives. And I'm not talking about your typical bedroom activities. We're looking at practices that would make your stomach turn and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about this ancient civilization. Some of these customs were tied to their religious beliefs, others to their social structures, and some were just plain bizarre. Fair warning, what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. But if you're curious about the darker side of human history, stick around because this is going to be eye-opening. Let's jump right into the most horrific and disturbing practices that happened behind closed doors in ancient Egypt. Let's start with something that sounds completely insane by today's standards: ritual necrophilia. Yes, you heard that right. In ancient Egypt, there were documented cases where priests would engage in intimate acts with mummified bodies. This wasn't considered disgusting or wrong, it was actually part of their religious ceremonies. They believed that by doing this, they were helping the dead person's soul transition to the afterlife. The practice was so common that embalmers had to wait several days before mummifying attractive women. Why? Because they needed to make sure the body had started decomposing enough that no one would be tempted to abuse it. This tells us that the problem was widespread enough that they had to create actual rules about it. Moving on to something equally disturbing, the practice of sibling marriage among royalty. Now I know what you're thinking, this happened in other cultures too. But the Egyptians took it to a whole different level. Brothers and sisters didn't just marry each other for political reasons. They were expected to produce children together, and this was seen as keeping the bloodline pure. Cleopatra VII, the famous queen we all know about, was actually the product of at least 5 generations of sibling marriages. Her parents were brother and sister, her grandparents were brother and sister, and so on. The genetic problems this caused were horrific. Many royal children were born with severe deformities, mental disabilities, and died young. But they kept doing it because they believed it made them more godlike. Let's talk about something called sacred prostitution. In many Egyptian temples, there were women called hieradoles who served as temple prostitutes. These weren't regular sex workers, they were considered holy women who served the gods through intimate acts. Men would come to the temple and pay money to be with these women. The women believed they were performing a sacred duty, and the men thought they were getting blessed by the gods. But here's where it gets really dark. Many of these women weren't there by choice. Young girls, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, were sold to temples by their families. They would spend their entire lives serving in this way, never allowed to leave or marry. The temple priests got rich off this system while these girls lived in what was basically sexual slavery. Now let's discuss something that might be the most disturbing of all, the defloration ceremonies. When young Egyptian girls reached puberty, there were elaborate rituals around taking their virginity. In some regions, this was done by priests in front of crowds of people. The girl would be brought to the temple, and the priest would perform the act while others watched and chanted. This was supposed to ensure the girl would be fertile and bring good luck to her future family. But imagine being a young teenage girl going through this traumatic experience in front of strangers. The psychological damage must have been incredible. Yet it was so normal that families would actually pay good money for these ceremonies. Here's another practice that shows how twisted things got: the worship of fertility through extreme acts. During certain festivals, Egyptian women would participate in public displays that were supposed to increase crop fertility. These festivals involved group activities that were so graphic that even ancient Roman writers, who weren't exactly prudes, were shocked by what they saw. Women would engage in acts with multiple partners, sometimes including animals, all in the name of making sure the Nile would flood properly and crops would grow. The belief was that human fertility was directly connected to the land's fertility. So the more extreme and public these acts were, the better the harvest would be. Let's talk about something called ritual castration. Certain priests in Egyptian temples had to be castrated to serve the gods properly. This wasn't done with any kind of anesthesia or proper medical tools. They would use crude knives or even sharp stones. Many men died from infection or blood loss during these procedures. But those who survived were considered blessed and held high positions in the temple hierarchy. These castrated priests were then used for various disturbing purposes within the temple system. They were seen as pure because they couldn't engage in normal intimate relationships. So they were often the ones performing the defloration ceremonies I mentioned earlier. The irony is sickening when you think about it. Another horrifying practice involved the treatment of female slaves. Egyptian slave owners had complete control over their female slaves' bodies. They could rent them out to other men, force them into arranged partnerships, or use them however they wanted. But it gets worse. If a female slave became pregnant, the owner could decide whether she would keep the baby or not. Often, if the baby wasn't useful to the owner, it would be killed immediately after birth. Female slaves had no rights, no protection, and no way to escape this system. They were treated worse than animals. Let's discuss the practice of ritual mutilation that happened to both men and women. As part of certain religious ceremonies, people would have their bodies permanently altered in disturbing ways. This included removing parts of their anatomy that were considered offerings to the gods. The procedures were done with no pain relief and often led to serious infections or death. But people believed that making these sacrifices would guarantee them a place in the afterlife. Families would sometimes volunteer their children for these procedures, thinking they were doing something good for them. The children, obviously, had no choice in the matter. Here's something that shows how the power structure worked in ancient Egypt: the pharaoh's right to any woman. The pharaoh could claim any woman in his kingdom, regardless of whether she was married or not. If he wanted someone's wife or daughter, he could simply take her. The woman's family was supposed to feel honored by this. But in reality, it destroyed families and left women with no control over their own lives. Some pharaohs had hundreds of wives and concubines, many of whom were taken against their will. These women lived in harems where they competed for the pharaoh's attention, often resorting to poisoning or other violent acts against each other. Let's talk about the disturbing coming-of-age rituals for young boys. When boys reached puberty, they had to prove their manhood through various tests. Some of these tests involved intimate acts with older men as a form of initiation. The boys had no choice but to participate if they wanted to be accepted as adults in society. This created a cycle where abuse was passed down from generation to generation. Boys who went through this would later do the same thing to the next generation of young men. The whole system was designed to maintain power structures through trauma and control. Another practice that was surprisingly common involved the use of animals in intimate rituals. Certain gods were represented by animals, and people believed they could connect with these gods through physical acts with these animals. Bulls, goats, and even crocodiles were used in these ceremonies. The animals were seen as sacred, but they were also being abused in the most horrific ways. People lined up to participate in these rituals, believing it would bring them good fortune. The animals, of course, had no choice and often died from the abuse. Let's discuss how women were treated during menstruation. Egyptian women were considered unclean and dangerous during their monthly cycles. They were locked away in special buildings and weren't allowed to touch food, water, or other people. But here's the disturbing part: during this time, they were sometimes used for specific rituals that were supposed to harness their dark power. These rituals involved acts that were both degrading and painful. Women had no way to refuse because it was considered their religious duty. The isolation and abuse during these times led to serious mental health problems for many women. Here's something that shows how children were treated: the practice of child marriage. Girls as young as 10 or 11 were married off to much older men. The wedding night was often traumatic and sometimes fatal for these young girls. But families did this because it meant one less mouth to feed and possibly some money from the girl's new family. The girls had no education, no preparation, and no understanding of what was happening to them. Many died in childbirth because their bodies weren't ready for pregnancy. Those who survived often lived lives of constant fear and pain. The final practice I want to discuss is perhaps the most systematic, the breeding programs. Wealthy Egyptians would sometimes treat their slaves like livestock. They would force certain slaves to reproduce with specific other slaves to create children with desired traits. These children were then raised as property, never knowing freedom or having any control over their lives. The breeding was often forced and violent, with no consideration for the people involved. Families were separated, children were sold, and the whole system was designed to create more slaves for the wealthy to exploit. This went on for thousands of years and affected millions of people. So there you have it, the dark side of ancient Egypt that most people never hear about. These weren't just isolated incidents or rare occurrences. These were widespread practices that were built into the very foundation of Egyptian society. It's important to remember that while we can admire the architectural achievements and cultural contributions of ancient civilizations, we shouldn't romanticize everything about them. Human history is full of darkness, and ancient Egypt was no exception. These practices show us how power, religion, and tradition can be used to justify the most horrific treatment of human beings. What did you think about these revelations? Did any of them shock you more than others? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this video educational, even though it was disturbing, please give it a like. And if you want to see more content about the hidden truths of ancient civilizations, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Remember, understanding the full truth about history, even the uncomfortable parts, helps us make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.